A whispered cry. The morning sun painted the horizon in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the gray concrete structure of Providence Memorial Hospital. Leona Marsh adjusted her freshly laundered scrubs, their pale blue fabric offering little comfort against the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. At 28 years old, Leona was no stranger to the fast-paced world of nursing. Yet today felt different, charged with an inexplicable energy. Her shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum floors as she stepped into the bustling main corridor. The cacophony of beeping monitors, the rustle of scrubs, and the low hum of hushed conversations greeted her. A clipboard in hand, she made her way to the nurse's station, where Karen, the head nurse, stood waiting. "Morning, Leona," Karen said without looking up from her tablet. Her tone was brisk, her focus unwavering. "You're on the second floor today, geriatrics. You'll be monitoring a few post-op patients, but most are long-term care cases. One in particular needs close attention. Clara Whitman, room 214. She's stable but frail, recovering from a severe infection. Keep an eye on her vitals." Leona nodded, flipping through the patient file Karen handed her. Clara's profile stared back at her. An elderly black woman, 87 years old, listed as widowed, and with no immediate family noted in her records. Something about the solemn photo of Clara, her eyes shadowed and weary, tugged at Leona's heart. "Anything else I should know?" Leona asked, her voice steady. Karen hesitated. "Clara's difficult to read. She's polite but reserved. I've noticed she tenses up when certain staff members are around. Just be patient with her." Leona didn't need more explanation. She had encountered patients like Clara before, those who had lived through lifetimes of hardship, carrying their burdens quietly. With a soft thanks, she headed toward the elevator. As she rode to the second floor, her thoughts wandered. Nursing had always been more than a job for Leona. It was her way of honoring her late grandmother, who had raised her after her parents passed away. Her grandmother, a fiercely independent woman, had taught Leona the value of compassion, especially for those society often overlooked. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet ding, and Leona stepped into the serene yet somber atmosphere of the geriatric wing. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of lavender air freshener. She made her way to room 214 and paused outside the door. The sound of the heart monitor beeping steadily reached her ears, accompanied by the faint creak of a rocking chair. Knocking lightly, Leona pushed the door open and stepped inside. Clara Whitman sat upright in her bed, her thin frame wrapped in a pale hospital gown. Her dark skin contrasted starkly against the stark white sheets, and her silver hair framed her face like a halo. She looked up as Leona entered, her eyes narrowing slightly before softening into a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," Leona greeted warmly. "I'm Leona Marsh, your nurse for today. How are you feeling?" Clara hesitated before answering, her voice soft and tinged with weariness. "As well as an old woman like me can feel in a place like this." Leona smiled gently, moving closer to check Clara's vitals. "I'll do my best to make your day a little brighter," she said, her tone genuine. As Leona worked, she noticed small details about Clara, the tremor in her hands as she reached for her water, the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever footsteps echoed in the hall, and the faint yellow stains on the cuffs of her gown. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, almost acrid. Leona frowned slightly but said nothing. "Mrs. Whitman, would you like me to help you freshen up?" Leona asked after finishing her check. "It might make you feel more comfortable." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'd appreciate that, dear," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. As Leona helped Clara to the bathroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clara's shoulders were tense, her movements cautious, as though she expected something to go wrong. When Leona returned to the bed to strip the soiled sheets, she noticed deeper yellow stains on the mattress cover beneath. The smell was pungent, sharp enough to make her nose sting. Mrs. Whitman, Leona began, keeping her tone neutral. It seems there's been a spill here. Did something happen? Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the blanket, her gaze fixed on the floor. It's nothing, dear, she said, her voice tight. Just an accident. But Leona wasn't convinced. The stains, the smell, Clara's trembling hands, it all pointed to something more. She decided not to press the issue. Not yet. Instead, she helped Clara settle back into bed and promised to return shortly with clean linens. As she exited the room, Leona couldn't shake the image of Clara's downcast eyes and the fear that seemed to linger just beneath the surface. She made her way back to the nurse's station, her mind racing. Something wasn't right, and Leona knew she couldn't ignore it. A lingering shadow. The rest of Leona's morning was a blur of routine checks and hurried notations in patient charts, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. Something about the elderly woman's demeanor gnawed at her, an unspoken fear hidden behind polite smiles and measured words. As Leona prepared to return to Clara's room, her focus sharpened. She resolved to tread carefully, determined to uncover the truth without causing her patient undue distress. When she entered room 214, Clara was sitting upright, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap. A tray of untouched food rested on the small table by her bedside, the soup congealing and the tea growing cold. Clara's eyes flicked up to meet Leona's, but they darted away almost instantly, focusing instead on the window. The blinds were drawn tightly shut, allowing only slivers of light to seep through. "Mrs. Whitman, you haven't touched your lunch," Leona said gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Is everything all right?" Clara hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "I'm not very hungry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Leona tilted her head, studying Clara's face. The fine lines etched into her skin told a story of resilience, but today they seemed to carry the weight of something heavier. "If you'd like, I can warm this up for you later," Leona offered. "Or maybe bring you something else. What's your favorite?" Clara's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're very kind, dear, but don't trouble yourself." Leona leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Mrs. Whitman, I want to help you. I noticed earlier that your gown and sheets were soiled. That's not normal, and I'm concerned. Can you tell me what happened?" Clara's hands stilled, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the blanket. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, trembling with hesitation. "It's nothing worth talking about." Leona felt a pang in her chest. She placed a comforting hand over Clara's, careful not to startle her. "It might feel that way, but your well-being is my priority. If something's bothering you, anything at all, you can tell me. I'm here to listen." Clara's eyes filled with unused tears, and she turned her face away, staring at the closed blinds. "Sometimes," she began, her voice faltering, "sometimes people think they can do as they please because no one will believe someone like me." The words hit Leona like a punch to the gut. She swallowed hard, keeping her expression neutral despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "Mrs. Whitman, what do you mean? Has someone been mistreating you?" Clara pressed her lips together, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I've lived long enough to know when to stay quiet," she said finally. "The world doesn't change for people like me." Leona's heart ached at the quiet resignation in Clara's voice. She wanted to press further, but Clara's body language was clear. She wasn't ready to say more. Instead, Leona decided to take another approach. "All right, Mrs. Whitman," she said softly, squeezing Clara's hand. "I won't push you, but if you ever feel like talking, I'm here. You don't have to carry this alone." Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Leona stayed with Clara for a while longer, helping her eat a few bites of soup and adjusting her pillows for comfort. Before leaving the room, she gently pulled the blinds open, letting in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. The light seemed to brighten Clara's features, though the shadow in her eyes remained. As Leona walked back to the nurse's station, her mind raced. Clara's words were vague, but their meaning was unmistakable. Someone in the hospital, someone Clara trusted for care, had betrayed that trust. Leona couldn't ignore it, but she also knew she had to tread carefully. Accusations without evidence could backfire, jeopardizing both her position and Clara's safety. She decided to start by reviewing Clara's file in greater detail. Perhaps the records would reveal something, a pattern of complaints, a note from another staff member, anything that could provide context. Leona pulled up Clara's electronic file at the station, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The record showed a history of stable vitals and steady recovery since Clara's admission. There were no documented incidents of concern, but one detail stood out. Clara's primary physician was listed as Dr. Victor Harlow, a name Leona recognized from whispers among the staff. Dr. Harlow was a seasoned doctor with a sterling reputation on paper, but rumors hinted at a cold, detached bedside manner and a habit of cutting corners. Leona frowned, her unease growing. She decided to speak with a fellow nurse who had worked in the geriatric wing longer than she had. Spotting Tara, a senior nurse, at the medication cart, Leona approached her. "Tara, do you have a moment?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Tara glanced up, her expression curious. "Sure, what's up?" "I'm caring for Clara Whitman in room 214, Leona began. "Have you noticed anything unusual about her case? Anything I should know?" Tara's face darkened slightly, and she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Clara's a sweet woman, but she's had a rough time here. She's been through a lot. Dr. Harlow oversees her case, and let's just say he's not exactly known for his compassion. He's efficient, but I've seen him lose his temper more than once." Leona's chest tightened. "Has Clara ever complained about him?" Tara hesitated. "Not directly, but she's definitely withdrawn when he's around. I've caught her flinching a few times when he enters the room. If you're noticing something, trust your gut. Patients like Clara need advocates." Leona nodded, her resolve hardening. "Thanks, Tara." She spent the rest of the afternoon keeping a watchful eye on Clara, her senses on high alert. At one point, she saw Dr. Harlow enter Clara's room, his expression as impassive as ever. Leona positioned herself nearby, pretending to organize supplies, and strained to hear their interaction. Clara's voice was barely audible, but Dr. Harlow's tone carried down the hallway, clipped, impatient, and devoid of warmth. When Dr. Harlow emerged from the room a few minutes later, Leona couldn't resist confronting him. "Dr. Harlow, do you have a moment?" He stopped, glancing at her with mild irritation. "What is it, Nurse Marsh, is it?" "Yes," Leona said, keeping her tone professional. "I just wanted to check on Mrs. Whitman's care plan. She seems a bit distressed." Dr. Harlow raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Whitman is an elderly patient with a history of poor health. Distress is to be expected. Is there anything else?" Leona hesitated, searching his face for any sign of guilt or concern. She found none. "No, sir. That's all." "Good. I have rounds to finish," he said curtly, brushing past her. As he disappeared down the corridor, Leona's unease deepened. Something wasn't right, and she was determined to find out what it was. But she needed to be careful. Dr. Harlow was powerful, and challenging him could have serious consequences. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense that Clara's safety depended on her intervention. Leona made a promise to herself. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. A trail of questions. Leona's resolve grew stronger as the day wore on. The nagging feeling that Clara needed protection had become impossible to ignore. As she finished her rounds and prepared to check on Clara one last time before her shift ended, Leona decided she needed more information. There had to be a pattern or a detail she was missing, something that would explain the fear in Clara's eyes whenever Dr. Harlow entered the room. The moment Leona stepped into Clara's room, she could sense the tension in the air. Clara sat silently, her gaze fixed on the window, though the blinds remained drawn as usual. The untouched dinner tray by her side and the slight tremble in her hand spoke volumes. "Mrs. Whitman, it's me, Leona," she said softly, pulling a chair beside Clara's bed. "How are you feeling?" Clara glanced at her, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I'm fine, dear," she murmured. But her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes betrayed her words. Leona leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about people thinking they can do as they please. I don't want to pry, but I'm worried about you. If there's something you want to tell me, I promise I'll listen and do everything I can to help." Clara's hand stilled on the blanket, her fingers clutching the fabric tightly. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, but then she shook her head. "It's not worth it," she said, her voice barely audible. "They won't believe me." Leona frowned, her heart aching at Clara's resignation. "You're wrong," she said gently but firmly. "I believe you. And if you trust me, I'll make sure someone else does too. You don't have to go through this alone." Clara's lips pressed together, and she looked away. Leona decided not to push further. Instead, she spent a few minutes helping Clara adjust her pillows and tidying the room. But as she moved around, she caught sight of a small, crumpled tissue tucked beneath the tray table. It was stained yellow, with faint streaks of something darker. A wave of nausea rolled through her. Was it blood? She pocketed the tissue discreetly, deciding to have it analyzed. The quiet investigation. After leaving Clara's room, Leona made her way to the hospital's lab. Though she didn't have clearance to order tests independently, she knew someone who might be able to help. Dr. Carla Nguyen, a pathologist, had worked with Leona during her training and had always been kind and approachable. Leona found Dr. Nguyen in the lab, bent over a microscope. "Carla," she said softly, not wanting to startle her. Dr. Nguyen looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Leona, long time no see. What brings you down here?" "I need a favor," Leona admitted, pulling the tissue from her pocket. "Can you analyze this? I found it in a patient's room, and I think it might be important." Dr. Nguyen's smile faded as she took the tissue, her expression becoming serious. "What's this about?" Leona hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think one of my patients, Mrs. Clara Whitman, might be in trouble. I've noticed things that don't add up. I just want to be sure before I say anything." Dr. Nguyen nodded. "I'll take a look. Give me a little time." "Thank you," Leona said, relief flooding her voice. "I owe you one." A chilling encounter. Leona returned to the nurse's station to update Clara's chart, her mind still spinning with possibilities. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Dr. Harlow approaching until his voice startled her. "Nurse Marsh," he said, his tone cold. "I hear you've been asking questions about Mrs. Whitman." Leona turned to face him, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. "I'm concerned about her well-being," she said evenly. "It's my job to advocate for my patients." Dr. Harlow's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "And it's my job to make medical decisions, not entertain baseless suspicions. I suggest you focus on your assigned duties and leave the diagnostics to me." Leona's stomach churned, but she refused to back down. "Of course, Dr. Harlow. I just want to ensure Mrs. Whitman receives the best care." Dr. Harlow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "She is, and I trust you'll remember your place." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Leona shaken but more determined than ever. Something about his tone, the veiled threat behind his words, confirmed her fears. Clara wasn't safe, and Leona couldn't stand by and do nothing. The evidence emerges. Later that evening, Leona received a call from Dr. Nguyen. "Leona, you were right to bring me that tissue," Carla said, her voice grim. "The yellow stain is urine, but those dark streaks, they're blood. And there's trace evidence of a chemical irritant, something that shouldn't be anywhere near a patient." Leona's blood ran cold, What kind of irritant? I can't say for sure, but it's consistent with a cleaning agent. It's possible someone intentionally exposed her to it. Leona thanked Carla and hung up, her hands trembling. This wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate harm. And she had a sickening feeling that Dr. Harlow was behind it. A plan in motion. Leona knew she needed more evidence before confronting anyone. She decided to discreetly monitor Clara's room, setting up her phone to record audio while she was away. It was a risky move, but she had to know what was happening when she wasn't there. The following morning, as she reviewed the recording in the break room, her suspicions were confirmed. Dr. Harlow's voice echoed through the audio, sharp and condescending. "You should be grateful we're wasting resources on you," he sneered. "People like you don't belong here." Leona's hands shook with anger and determination. She couldn't let this continue. Armed with the recording and Carla's lab results, she prepared to take the next step, reporting Dr. Harlow to hospital administration, and, if necessary, the authorities. Clara's safety and justice depended on it. The breaking point. Leona Marsh's resolve hardened as she stared at the evidence in front of her. The lab results confirming deliberate harm, the recording capturing Dr. Harlow's vile words, and Clara Whitman's trembling, frightened face etched in her memory. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or gut feeling. This was undeniable proof. Someone who had sworn an oath to heal and protect was instead abusing his position of power. But Leona wasn't naive. She knew that exposing someone like Dr. Harlow, a respected senior physician with decades of influence, wouldn't be easy. The hospital's bureaucracy was designed to protect its own, and going against a doctor of his stature could jeopardize her career. Worse, it could leave Clara vulnerable to retaliation. As she sat in the dimly lit break room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, Leona mapped out her next steps. She needed allies. People who could corroborate her story and lend weight to her evidence. And she needed to do it quickly, before Dr. Harlow caught wind of her plans. A quiet ally. Leona's first thought was Tara, the senior nurse who had hinted at Dr. Harlow's cold demeanor. If anyone would be willing to speak out, it was her. Leona found Tara at the medication cart, meticulously organizing supplies. "Tara," Leona began hesitantly, "I need to talk to you about something important." Tara glanced up, her brows furrowing at Leona's serious tone. "What's going on?" Leona took a deep breath and lowered her voice. "It's about Clara Whitman. I have evidence that Dr. Harlow has been mistreating her. I overheard him making racist and demeaning remarks, and the lab confirmed that someone exposed her to a chemical irritant. I need your help to make sure this stops." Tara's eyes widened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she exhaled sharply, her expression grim. "I knew he was harsh, but I didn't think it went this far." "It has," Leona said firmly, "and we can't ignore it. But I can't do this alone." Tara hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "If you're serious about this, I'll back you up, but you'd better be ready for a fight. The administration won't take kindly to accusations against someone like Harlow." Leona nodded, her chest tightening with gratitude and apprehension. "Thank you, Tara. I won't let this go, but having you on my side makes all the difference." Taking it to the top, Leona and Tara decided to approach Karen, the head nurse. If they could convince her to support their case, it would add credibility to their claims and make it harder for the administration to dismiss them outright. Karen's office was small but meticulously organized, with stacks of patient files and a bulletin board covered in schedules and memos. When Leona and Tara entered, Karen looked up from her desk, her expression curious. "What's this about?" she asked, folding her hands on the desk. Leona wasted no time. She placed the lab report and her phone on Karen's desk, explaining everything in detail: the suspicious stains, Clara's fear, the recording, and the lab results. Tara chimed in, sharing her own observations of Dr. Harlow's behavior. Karen's face remained impassive as she listened, but Leona could see the tension in her jaw. When they finished, Karen leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. "This is serious," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, and the evidence certainly points that way, it's a violation of every code we stand for. But going after Dr. Harlow won't be easy. The administration will push back hard." "We're ready," Leoma said, her voice steady. "But we need your support." Karen studied them for a moment, then nodded. "You have it. I'll take this to the hospital director. In the meantime, keep an eye on Clara and document everything. We'll need as much as we can get." The confrontation. Later that afternoon, as Leona checked on Clara, she felt a sense of unease settle over her. Clara was quieter than usual, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. Leona had just finished changing Clara's linens when the door swung open, and Dr. Harlow strode in. He froze upon seeing Leona, his expression darkening. "Nurse Marsh," he said coldly, "what are you doing here?" "Caring for my patient," Leona replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. Dr. Harlow's lips curled into a smirk. "I see. Well, your services won't be needed here any longer. I'll be taking over Mrs. Whitman's care." Clara stiffened, her eyes darting to Leona in silent panic. Leona's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "With all due respect, Dr. Harlow, I was assigned to Mrs. Whitman, and I intend to continue providing her care." Dr. Harlow stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You've been meddling in things you don't understand, Nurse Marsh. I suggest you remember your place before you find yourself out of a job." Leona met his gaze unflinchingly. "And I suggest you remember yours, Dr. Harlow. Your actions have consequences." For a moment, the tension was suffocating, but then Dr. Harlow's smirk faltered. He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Leona turned to Clara, who was visibly shaken. "Don't worry," she said softly, placing a comforting hand on Clara's arm. "You're safe. I won't let him hurt you again." The meeting. The following day, Leona, Tara, and Karen met with the hospital director, Dr. Elias Monroe, in his expansive office. Leona presented the evidence, her notes, the lab report, and the recording. Dr. Monroe listened intently, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When Leona finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is a serious accusation," he said, "but the evidence is compelling. I'll authorize an immediate investigation. In the meantime, Dr. Harlow will be placed on administrative leave." Leona felt a wave of relief, but she knew the battle wasn't over. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe. Please ensure Mrs. Whitman's safety during the investigation." Dr. Monroe nodded. "You have my word." A glimmer of hope. That evening, Leona returned to Clara's room. The elderly woman's face lit up when she saw her, and for the first time, Leona noticed a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Mrs. Whitman," Leona said, sitting beside her bed, "Dr. Harlow won't be bothering you anymore. You're safe now." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You did this for me." Leona smiled gently. "I did it for you, and for every patient who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Clara reached out and grasped Leona's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." As Leona sat with Clara, a sense of peace washed over her. The road ahead would be difficult, but for now, she had done the right thing. And that was enough. Shadows of retribution. Leona Marsh's relief was short-lived. Although Dr. Harlow had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, his shadow loomed large over the hospital. Whispers followed Leona wherever she went, some filled with admiration for her bravery, others dripping with skepticism or outright hostility. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to regret it. Clara Whitman's safety and dignity were worth any personal cost. Still, the backlash was palpable. Some of the senior staff, loyal to Dr. Harlow, avoided Leona entirely. Others were less subtle, openly questioning her credibility in hushed conversations that were just loud enough for her to overhear. Even her fellow nurses seemed divided. Tara stood firmly by her side, but others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their careers by association. Leona found herself eating lunch alone in the cafeteria one afternoon, pushing a sandwich around her plate without appetite. The whispers behind her had reached a crescendo when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Karen, the head nurse, standing beside her with an unreadable expression. "Mind if I join you?" Karen asked. Leona gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Of course." Karen sat down, her gaze steady. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," she said, "but I want you to know you did the right thing." Leona sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It doesn't feel that way sometimes. People are acting like I've betrayed the hospital." Karen's expression softened. Change is never easy, and it's even harder when it threatens people's comfort zones. But you're not alone in this, Leona. Dr. Monroe is taking the investigation seriously, and so am I. Leona managed a small smile. "Thank you, Karen. That means a lot." Karen leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "By the way, I've heard that Harlow's lawyer is already making noise. He's claiming you fabricated evidence to discredit him." Leona's heart sank. "That's ridiculous. Why would I do that?" Karen shrugged. "Desperation. He's grasping at straws, but be prepared. This could get ugly." The anonymous threat. Later that evening, as Leona finished her shift and headed to the parking lot, a sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck. The usually bustling hospital grounds were eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustle of leaves in the cold night air. Reaching her car, Leona noticed something unusual. A folded piece of paper was wedged under the windshield wiper. Frowning, she pulled it out and unfolded it under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. The note was handwritten in bold, jagged letters. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Back off, or you'll regret it." Leona's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling as she reread the words. She glanced around the parking lot, but it was empty. Swallowing her fear, she quickly got into her car, locking the doors before starting the engine. Her mind raced as she drove home. Who had left the note? Was it one of Dr. Harlow's supporters, or was it from the man himself? The timing was no coincidence. Someone wanted to intimidate her into silence, but instead of backing down, the threat only fueled her determination. If they were trying to scare her, it meant she was on the right track. Rallying support. The next morning, Leona arrived at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. She showed the note to Karen, who immediately contacted Dr. Monroe. By mid-morning, they were all seated in his office, the note spread out on the desk. "This is unacceptable," Dr. Monroe said, his face dark with anger. "Whoever did this will face severe consequences if we can identify them." Leona nodded, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I'm not going to let this stop me, but I need to know that Clara and I are safe." Dr. Monroe leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We'll increase security in Clara's wing and monitor who accesses her room. As for you, Leona, I suggest you keep a low profile for now. Avoid being alone in isolated areas." Karen placed a reassuring hand on Leona's arm. "You've got people on your side. Don't forget that." Clara speaks. Later that afternoon, Leona visited Clara, determined to keep her spirits high despite the mounting tension. Clara was sitting by the window for the first time, the blinds drawn open to let in the sunlight. The change lifted Leona's mood instantly. "Mrs. Whitman, it's nice to see you enjoying the view," Leona said, setting a cup of tea on the bedside table. Clara turned, her eyes bright with gratitude. "It feels different," she said, "like the weight's been lifted. I've been waiting a long time for someone to listen." Leona pulled up a chair, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her blanket. "Dr. Harlow isn't the first to treat me this way, but he's the worst. I've been in and out of hospitals for years, and it's always the same. People look at me and see a burden." Her voice faltered, and Leona reached out to take her hand. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Whitman. You deserve the same care and respect as anyone else." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've shown me that, and for the first time, I feel like someone's fighting for me." Leona's chest tightened. "I'll keep fighting," she promised. "For you and for every patient who needs it." A breaking revelation. As the investigation progressed, Leona continued to gather evidence, working closely with Karen and Dr. Monroe. One evening, while reviewing hospital records, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. A series of patient complaints about Dr. Harlow had been quietly filed away, each dismissed without follow-up. The patterns were disturbingly consistent. Elderly patients, many of them from marginalized backgrounds, reporting verbal abuse or neglect. Leona's hands trembled as she compiled the records into a report. This wasn't just about Clara. Dr. Harlow had a history of misconduct, and the hospital had turned a blind eye. The next day, Leona presented the findings to Dr. Monroe. His face paled as he read through the report, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This changes everything," he said finally. "We can't ignore this any longer." The hearing. Dr. Harlow was summoned to a formal hearing before the hospital board, with Leona, Karen, and Dr. Monroe presenting the evidence against him. Clara Whitman, bolstered by Leona's support, bravely gave her testimony, recounting her experiences with quiet strength. Dr. Harlow, though defiant at first, began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. His arrogance turned to desperation as more witnesses came forward, sharing similar stories of abuse and neglect. By the end of the hearing, the board reached a unanimous decision. Dr. Harlow's medical license was suspended, and he was permanently dismissed from the hospital. A new chapter. The day after the hearing, Leona visited Clara one last time before her discharge. Clara was dressed in her own clothes, her face radiant with hope. "You did it," Clara said, her voice filled with emotion. "You made them listen." Leona smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We did it, Mrs. Whitman, together." As Clara left the hospital, Leona felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. She had fought for what was right, and though the road had been difficult, it was worth every step. For Clara, and for the countless others like her, Leona knew she would keep fighting, no matter the cost. The ripple effect. The news of Dr. Harlow's dismissal and the hospital board's decision spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a victory for Leona Marsh and Clara Whitman. It was a seismic shift that rippled across Providence Memorial Hospital and beyond. The once silent whispers of discontent among the staff turned into an open conversation about accountability, patient care, and the toxic power dynamics that had festered under the surface for years. Leona, however, felt no triumph as she walked into the hospital the next morning. The fight had taken its toll. Though she had stood up for what was right, the road ahead was uncertain. Would the administration support her moving forward, or would they quietly find a way to edge her out? The weight of these questions hung over her like a storm cloud. But she wasn't alone anymore. Clara's farewell. Clara Whitman had been discharged the day after the hearing, but not before sharing a moment with Leona that would stay with her forever. The elderly woman, once frail and subdued, now stood a little taller. Her once quiet voice carried a hint of strength as she clasped Leona's hands tightly. "Leona," Clara said, her eyes glistening with tears, "you've given me something I thought I'd lost long ago. Hope. For so many years, I thought my voice didn't matter, that no one cared. But you cared. You listened when no one else would." Leona's throat tightened as she fought back tears. "Mrs. Whitman, you've inspired me more than I can say. You're not just my patient. You're my hero. Your courage to speak up made all of this possible." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Promise me you won't stop fighting for people like me. There are so many others out there who need someone like you." Leona nodded, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "I promise. A new perspective. In the weeks following Dr. Harlow's dismissal, the hospital began to change. Karen spearheaded new training programs aimed at fostering empathy and cultural competence among staff, ensuring that no patient would ever feel neglected or demeaned again. Leona became a key voice in these efforts, drawing from her experience with Clara to advocate for policies that prioritized patient dignity and equitable care. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Some of Dr. Harlow's supporters continued to resist the changes, grumbling about wokeness and overreach. Leona faced subtle pushback from colleagues who resented her role in bringing down a senior doctor. Yet she remained steadfast, leaning on allies like Tara and Karen, who stood by her side every step of the way. One day, as Leona was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station, Tara approached her with a sly grin. "Guess who just got nominated for the hospital's Excellence in Patient Advocacy Award?" Leona blinked in surprise. "You're kidding." Tara shook her head, her grin widening. "Not kidding. You've earned it, Leona. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Leona felt a flush of warmth spread through her. The nomination wasn't about recognition. It was a validation of everything she had fought for. Justice beyond the hospital. Meanwhile, the consequences of Dr. Harlow's actions extended far beyond Providence Memorial. The hospital's internal investigation revealed a history of complaints that had been quietly buried over the years. The media caught wind of the scandal, and soon it became a national story. Dr. Harlow's license was officially revoked, and several lawsuits were filed against him by former patients and their families. Leona's role in exposing the truth brought her unexpected attention. Journalists reached out for interviews, and advocacy groups invited her to speak at events. Though the spotlight made her uncomfortable at first, she realized the importance of using her voice to shine a light on the systemic issues that allowed people like Dr. Harlow to operate unchecked. At one such event, Leona spoke to a room full of nurses, doctors, and healthcare administrators. She shared Clara Whitman's story, emphasizing the power of compassion and the responsibility of healthcare professionals to advocate for their patients. "Healthcare isn't just about curing illnesses," she said, her voice steady. "It's about healing people. And healing starts with seeing the humanity in every person who comes through our doors." The audience erupted into applause, but Leona's thoughts were with Clara. She hoped the elderly woman was watching, knowing that her courage had sparked this movement. A surprise reunion. Months later, on a quiet spring afternoon, Leona received a call from an unfamiliar number. She answered hesitantly, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Leona, it's Clara." Leona's heart leaped. "Mrs. Whitman, how are you?" Clara chuckled, her voice warm and full of life. "I'm better than I've been in years, thanks to you. I'm living with my niece now, and she's taking good care of me. I just wanted to thank you again for everything." Leona felt tears prick at her eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Whitman. I was just doing my job." "No, dear," Clara said firmly. "You went above and beyond, and I'll never forget it." The two women talked for nearly an hour, catching up on each other's lives. Clara shared stories of her newfound happiness, while Leona spoke about her continued efforts to improve the hospital. When the call ended, Leona sat in her chair, smiling through her tears. Moving forward, Leona's journey didn't end with Clara's case. It was only the beginning. She continued to advocate for systemic change within the hospital, using her experiences to mentor younger nurses and inspire them to stand up for their patients. Her work earned her respect from colleagues who once doubted her, and she became a trusted leader in her field. Though the road was difficult, Leona never forgot the promise she made to Clara. Every decision she made, every patient she cared for, was a testament to that promise. And every time she felt doubt or fear, she remembered Clara's words, "You've given me hope." The legacy of courage. Years later, as Leona stood in front of a packed auditorium to accept an award for her contributions to patient advocacy, she thought of Clara Whitman. She dedicated the award to Clara and every patient who had ever been overlooked or mistreated, vowing to keep fighting for a world where every voice mattered. The applause that followed was deafening, but Leona didn't hear it. In her heart, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, an unshakable certainty that she had made a difference. And that was enough.